in the Ethiopian Bible and discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, tells a story that Western biblical traditions barely touch. It speaks of a time when angels, known as the Watchers, descended to earth, defying divine law, and shared forbidden knowledge with humans. They taught secrets of the heavens and the earth, astronomy, metalwork, incantations, but in doing so, they altered the natural order. From these unions between Watchers and human women came the Nephilim, beings of extraordinary size and power, whose presence shook the foundations of human society. The story of the Nephilim is more than just a tale of giants. It is a reflection on the consequences of power, curiosity, and rebellion. Imagine a world where the natural balance was disrupted, where knowledge was misused not for growth, but for domination. These giants were not merely physical marvels. They were agents of chaos, capable of violence and destruction that left entire communities terrified. Their very existence challenged the fragile moral fabric of humanity, highlighting the dangers of unchecked influence and the blurred lines between divine will and human ambition. In this context, the pre-flood world becomes more than history. It becomes a mirror for modern society, where technology and knowledge can create both wonders and disasters if wielded without wisdom. The Watchers themselves are fascinating figures. They were angels, beings of light and authority, yet they succumbed to desire and curiosity, drawn to the human world in ways that defied divine instruction. Their fascination with humanity was not innocent. It was a blend of admiration, ambition, and the temptation of power. By sharing knowledge that humans were not ready to wield, they created a ripple effect that transformed the earth. The Nephilim, born from these unions, inherited both the strength of the angels and the flaws of humanity. They became figures of awe and terror, inspiring stories and legends that would persist long after their disappearance. Through their tale, the Book of Giants asks profound questions about responsibility, morality, and the boundaries of knowledge. The pre-flood era, as described in these texts, was one of tension and imbalance. Human societies were struggling with their own moral and ethical choices, and the arrival of the Nephilim only magnified those struggles. Communities feared the giants, but they also envied them. Humans coveted the knowledge that the Watchers had brought, hoping to harness it for themselves. The result was a world teetering on the brink, where violence and corruption became daily realities. These narratives, while ancient, resonate with modern concerns: how power can corrupt, how knowledge without discipline can harm, and how ethical choices determine the fate of civilizations. By looking at the Nephilim and the Watchers, we are reminded that history is not only about events, but about the choices and consequences that define them. Yet, there is a deeper human connection within these stories. Despite their supernatural origin, the Nephilim experienced fear, doubt, and moral conflict. They were not invincible beings without conscience. Their extraordinary abilities were paired with the same struggles that humans face: the challenge of understanding right from wrong, the temptation to dominate, and the burden of choice. By humanizing these figures, the Book of Giants allows us to see ourselves in their story. It suggests that even beings of immense power are bound by the same ethical and spiritual dilemmas that govern human life. Their narrative is both a warning and an invitation to consider how knowledge, power, and morality intertwine in shaping the destiny of the world. The historical and biblical context of this story adds layers of significance. The Nephilim and the Watchers appear briefly in the canonical Hebrew Bible, but their story is fully revealed in apocryphal texts like the Book of Giants. These writings provide insight into the world before Noah, offering perspectives that challenge and expand our understanding of ancient scripture. They show a civilization grappling with extraordinary beings, divine interventions, and moral crises. The flood, as a response to this corruption, is portrayed not just as a historical event, but as a necessary reset, a moment where the world had to be cleansed so that humanity could begin anew. Understanding this context helps us grasp why these stories persisted, why they were preserved in certain traditions, and why they continue to captivate readers today. The imagery evoked by the Book of Giants is vivid and cinematic. Picture a towering Nephilim walking through a city, their very presence casting a shadow that chills and awes the human inhabitants. Imagine the Watchers descending from the skies, bringing forbidden knowledge that humanity is eager yet unprepared to receive. These scenes, though ancient, feel immediate because they explore universal human themes: the allure of power, the consequences of disobedience, and the eternal struggle between what is known and what is forbidden. By framing the narrative in such a vivid way, the story becomes not just historical or religious, but deeply relatable, engaging viewers as though they are witnessing these events firsthand. As we begin this journey into the world before the flood, it is essential to reflect on what the story asks of us today. The Nephilim and the Watchers were part of a world that faced moral collapse because knowledge was misused and boundaries were crossed. In our own time, we navigate similarly complex terrains, with technologies and insights that can either build or destroy. Their story, preserved through centuries, serves as a timeless reminder of the responsibilities that come with power and knowledge, of the consequences of choices made without foresight, and of the shadows that linger long after events have passed. If you find this story intriguing and want to uncover more of these hidden biblical narratives, make sure to subscribe to our channel, share this video with your friends, and help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support through a super thanks allows us to continue creating these stories. Also, comment below with your name and city, letting us know where you are watching from. If you wish to read the complete Bible 88 books or the Book of Enoch in English, the links are provided in the description. Your engagement keeps this journey alive and ensures that these ancient, forgotten stories reach new audiences. The first pieces of the Book of Giants were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which had been buried for hundreds of years in the dry caves near Qumran. These scrolls, which were written during the Second Temple period, had parts of texts that Western traditions had long since forgotten. The Book of Giants goes into more detail about the Nephilim, who were the children of the Watchers and human women, than what is found in the Bible. This text, on the other hand, goes into great detail about the world before the flood, when huge beings walked the earth, bringing both awe and fear. The Ethiopian Bible, which has all 88 books, kept these stories from being completely lost, even though many Western translations left them out or made them much shorter. Scholars gained important knowledge about early Jewish thought and apocryphal literature from the discovery of these fragments. The text is apocryphal, which means that it wasn't accepted by everyone into the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Old Testament. However, it does give ideas that are very similar to those in the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch tells the story of how the Watchers came down to earth and gave people forbidden knowledge. The Book of Giants, on the other hand, is about the children of these angels and humans, their lives, their moral struggles, and the bad things that will happen because of what they do. These complementary texts provide a more comprehensive understanding of ancient cosmology, divine justice, and the conflict between corruption and righteousness in the antediluvian era. The pieces show a world that was both strange and familiar. Not only were the Nephilim big, they were also smart, aware, and able to make moral decisions. Some people wanted to be forgiven or to understand God's will, while others did what they wanted, which upset the balance of human society. The text tells these stories with vivid pictures, often in the form of conversations between the giants as they tell each other about their fears and visions. Scholars have observed that these narratives were probably part of a larger collection of writings that aim to explain where evil comes from and what happens when people cross divine lines. The apocryphal character of the Book of Giants elucidates its relative obscurity. In Western biblical traditions, Early translators and religious leaders often chose texts to be part of the canon, based on how well they fit with their beliefs, how consistent their teachings were, and how useful they thought they would be spiritually. Tales of angelic beings copulating with humans, producing hybrid progeny, and the intricate moral dilemmas faced by these titans probably appeared contentious or even perilous to conventional religious doctrines. As a result, many of these stories were left out of Western Bibles, and texts like Genesis 6 only mention the Nephilim in passing or in pieces. The Ethiopian Bible, on the other hand, kept a larger number of books, such as the Book of Enoch and the Book of Giants. This is how these rich stories were able to live on. The Book of Giants is important not only because of its story, but also because of the time and place it was written. The text comes from a time when Jewish communities were trying to figure out what divine justice, human responsibility, and evil in the world meant. The scrolls indicate that these narratives were extensively disseminated among specific sects, providing moral guidance and theological contemplation. These fragments show how divine beings and humans interact, which is similar to how people today are worried about morality, social order, and the limits of what humans can know. People told stories about giants that weren't just made-up stories. They were also lessons about pride, ambition, and what happens when you break God's laws. Parts of the scrolls also suggest that the Book of Giants had visions and dreams that the giants themselves understood. These dreams often hinted at the flood that was about to happen, which added tension to the story and made it clear that divine judgment was unavoidable. Some giants, knowing what was going to happen, asked for help or mercy, while others stood their ground, showing a range of moral awareness. The Book of Giants stands out from simpler biblical stories because of its complicated plot. This shows how early Jewish literature was able to explore moral and spiritual issues in a deeper way. The link to the Book of Enoch is very important for understanding the bigger picture of theology. Enoch acts as a good middleman, passing on God's warnings and keeping track of what the Watchers do. The Book of Giants, on the other hand, is about the hybrid's own experiences. This additional point of view helps us understand how early communities may have thought about how God and people interacted and what happened when people broke moral rules. It highlights the giants' human-like traits, such as their fears, struggles, and even their efforts to understand things, which makes their story relatable, even though they are very different from us. There are many references to the Bible throughout the text that make it more real and connect it to canonical scripture. The story is set in a familiar biblical world because it talks about the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the corruption that happened before the flood. The text's credibility is also supported by its historical context. The fragments are from the first few centuries BCE, which was a time of great literary and religious activity in Jewish communities. These groups were writing apocalyptic works, moral essays, and stories that built on well-known scriptures. This suggests that the Book of Giants was part of a larger intellectual and spiritual effort to understand human suffering, divine justice, and the order of the universe. There are many reasons why it is not present in Western biblical stories. Aside from worries about controversial material, the fact that surviving manuscripts were incomplete made it hard for early translators to put together a coherent text. Theological conservatism also preferred texts that supported existing doctrine, which meant that stories that were more complicated, morally gray, or sensational were not included in the canon. The Book of Giants' survival in Ethiopian Christianity shows how different early biblical traditions were, and how different groups valued and kept different texts. This variety shows how important it is to look at more than one source to fully understand pre-flood stories and the moral and spiritual lessons they teach. The Book of Giants still gives us deep insights into how people thought, how they lived morally, and how they thought about spirituality because it has been preserved. It makes readers think about the lines between divine and human action, the effects of moral choice, and how knowledge can be both helpful and harmful. Its rich story, true to life history, and ties to canonical scripture make it an important resource for anyone who wants to learn more about the complicated history of the time before the flood and the lasting interest in giants and the Watchers. The scrolls remind us that there are many parts of biblical history that most people don't know about, but that are still important to communities that are trying to figure out what is right and wrong, who has power and how God works, by looking at where the Book of Giants came from, why it is not in the Bible, and how it is kept in the Ethiopian Bible. You can better understand how complicated biblical history is. The text connects canonical scripture with the more complex and detailed stories that ancient communities used to understand their world. Its rediscovery gives modern readers a chance to see a world that is both far away and very close to the human experience, showing how beings who lived on Earth long before the flood came to be, what they went through, and the moral choices they had to make. The Watchers were unlike anything humans had ever seen before. They were angels made to serve, watch over and keep the balance of creation, but something inside them made them want more than just to obey. They were drawn to the beauty, strength, and complexity of the human world, so they started to stay where they shouldn't have. Their fall wasn't a sudden act of rebellion. It was a slow pull toward curiosity, interest, and finally defiance. They walked among people without being seen, but they had an effect on them. They watched how life worked and how human civilizations grew. What started as watching from a distance quickly turned into interaction as they shared knowledge that humans were never meant to have. The Watchers' forbidden teachings changed the course of human history. They taught people about astronomy by showing them how the stars move, how the moon changes phases, and how the heavens change. Metallurgy used to be a secret art of changing things and making them last. Now it is a craft for building, making, and sometimes destroying. They whispered spells and secrets about magic, how to control natural forces, and how to make the line between the physical and the spiritual less clear. People were amazed and scared when they got these gifts, not knowing how they would affect them. These lessons were more than just useful skills. They came with the weight of knowledge and the burden of understanding cosmic laws that people weren't ready to handle. But the Watchers weren't immune to the problems and temptations they caused. They were very powerful beings, but they had trouble with their own wants and needs. Some of them really cared about people and wanted to help and protect them, while others were driven by ambition, pride, and the thrill of breaking the rules. Their reasons were complicated, a mix of caring, wanting to know more, and pride. They changed the natural order by giving people these skills, but they also had to deal with the consequences of their actions. Did they really know what would happen if they did what they did? Good beings who had been in the presence of God misjudge how weak human morality is. The Watchers were haunted by these questions as they walked the earth with the creatures they weren't allowed to change. Their fall had immediate and serious effects. The structure of societies began to change as people learned new things. Metal tools and weapons changed farming and fighting. Calendars, rituals, and religious ideas were all changed by astronomy and looking at the sky. Magic and secret arts blurred the lines of morality, giving power to those who were willing to use it without caring about right and wrong. These changes caused problems that affected people, communities, and the environment. Some people were amazed by the gifts, while others were greedy, jealous, and violent, which caused chaos that spread throughout the world before the flood. The Watchers played a big part in the story of corruption, curiosity, and consequence that was happening at the time. They were both helpers and troublemakers. To understand their story, you need to make the Watchers more human. They weren't faraway, faceless forces. They had doubts, fights, and even guilt. Some people saw the risks of what they were doing and wondered if they had gone too far with God's rules. Others did things because they were afraid of being caught or punished. The text shows how they struggled through conversation and thought, showing that even powerful beings are limited by their morals and the effects of their actions. They could see the violence and destruction growing, but their power made them complicit. The Watchers are relatable because their choices are similar to the moral dilemmas that people face every day, like choosing between right and wrong, ambition and restraint, and curiosity and respect for limits. Biblical references throughout the texts help the story of the Watchers fit into a familiar framework. Genesis 6 talks about the sons of God who saw the daughters of humans and married them. This led to the Nephilim. The Book of Enoch goes into more detail about this by naming certain angels, describing how they came down, and writing down how they shared forbidden knowledge. These references lend credence to the narrative and place the Watchers in a larger theological framework. They weren't just made-up characters. They were part of a moral universe where divine law, human behavior, and cosmic order came together in ways that changed the fate of all creation. The stories about the Watchers stress how beautiful and dangerous their gifts are. The information they gave could have made people better and helped them understand the universe and the natural world. But without moral guidance, it became a cause of destruction. People used weapons made from their teachings in wars, magic to control people, and ambition to turn knowledge into evil. Their story is all about the tension between possibility and danger, which shows how fragile the balance is between power and responsibility. It reminds us that even good intentions can have big effects when they are based on desire instead of wisdom. The Watchers and humans didn't just do business with each other. Some angels formed authentic emotional bonds with their students, feeling love, pride, and even sorrow regarding the consequences of their guidance. These feelings made it harder for them to know what was right and wrong, because they had to deal with the results of choices that weren't all their own. The story connects the divine and human experiences by showing them as beings who can feel, question, and regret. It is both cosmic and personal. Their presence serves as a reminder that the conflict among morality, knowledge, and power transcends humanity, reverberating throughout all levels of creation. The legacy of the Watchers is entwined with the Nephilim, their hybrid offspring who inherited both the strengths and flaws of their angelic and human lineage. The Watchers' influence became real in the world through them, changing the course of history and shaping societies. The giants' actions showed what they had learned and what they had done wrong in the past. This shows that passing on knowledge can be both helpful and harmful. When you look at the Watchers, you can see where these moral problems came from, where corruption starts and where redemption is possible. All in a story that takes place in both heaven and earth. People are still interested in the Watchers because their story answers big questions. What happens when beings who are supposed to watch over and protect cross lines? How do morality, knowledge, and desire work together to shape our futures? Their story lets us think about these questions in a time before the flood, showing us the moral and spiritual problems that have always been a part of human life. The story of the Watchers is still interesting because it focuses on their choices, motivations, and struggles. It shows how hard it is to find the right balance between obedience, curiosity, and the problems that come up when that balance is broken. The Book of Giants and the Book of Enoch together tell these events in a more detailed way, giving the Watchers life and voice. The pre-flood story is based on their fall, their teachings, and what happened as a result. Their story reveals the origins of the Nephilim, elucidates the ethical dilemmas of the period, and illustrates the dynamics of human and divine interaction in a manner that is both captivating and educational. The Watchers, with all their flaws and complexities, are still at the heart of the story. They connect heaven and earth and make us think deeply about the power and danger of crossing the boundaries of creation. People who saw the Watchers in human. Women get together didn't fully understand what was going on. Angels, who are beings of light and great power, broke the rules set by God because they were drawn to the beauty, strength, and curiosity of people. The women involved, who often didn't know what the full effects would be, got caught up in a process that would change the world forever. These were not normal births. The children born from these unions were amazing in every way. They were called the Nephilim, and they were giants who were much stronger and bigger than normal people. Some people were in awe of their size and strength, while others were scared, and many people felt both at the same time. People in whole communities whispered about them, and villages were amazed when one Nephilim could lift stones that weighed more than 100 men, or move through the landscape with unstoppable force. The Nephilim had unique traits from the time they were born. They grew quickly, and within a few years, their bodies were taller than those of adults. Their senses were sharper, their minds were sharper, and their curiosity was endless. Some people looked at the world with awe, like children learning and experimenting with the mysteries of creation. Others, on the other hand, instinctively pushed boundaries, their strength and impulses unchecked. These giants were living examples of the duality that ran through their family. The divine spark of the Watchers mixed with the moral and emotional complexity of their human ancestry. People around them wondered if these children of heaven were there to help people, or if they were there to destroy everything. And their presence would tear apart the fragile fabric of society. The giants' relationships with human families were complicated and full of problems. Some Nephilim were taken care of by their mothers and the communities that didn't want them but had to accept them. These communities formed bonds that showed both love and fear. Children born to angels and humans weren't bad by nature, but their power and otherness caused problems. Farms were destroyed by accident. Forests were cut down with just one step, and animals went missing in ways that were too strange to explain. People in the village and nearby, who used to admire how big and strong the kids were, started to be afraid of what they couldn't control. As misunderstandings, jealousy, and fear grew, the tension between human families and the giants grew, which was a sign of bigger problems to come. People had a hard time balancing awe and respect with fear and self-preservation. This made it possible for every meeting with a Nephilim to end in violence or tragedy. The lives of the giants were full of moral gray areas. They weren't bad people by nature, but they had tendencies that could be abused easily. Some showed empathy by using their strength to protect weak people or help communities in useful ways. Others, because of their dual nature or the Watcher's influence, gave in to anger, pride, or aggression. Villages had times when they got help that seemed like a miracle, and then they had times when things went wrong. People started to wonder if the Nephilim were blessed or cursed, and if their existence was a test from God or a big mistake. These questions made people afraid and curious, which kept societies in a state of uneasy tension that would spread to larger civilizations. People outside of the giants' home communities also noticed their amazing skills. People in faraway places heard about how big, smart, and strange they were. People who had never met them directly heard stories about how strong they were, which made up legends and rumors that sometimes made things seem better than they were, but often got to the heart of the matter. Leaders wanted to know if these beings were friends or enemies. Some tried to talk to them peacefully, while others got ready to fight. These interactions show how fragile the world was before the flood, when extraordinary power made it hard for people to understand and forced communities to deal with fear, awe, and moral dilemmas all at once. As the giants got older, the emotional tension in families became more complicated. Mothers and other family members were proud of their children's skills, but they were also scared of what might happen next. Some fathers, unable to reconcile the divine origin of these beings with their human experiences, treated them with suspicion or hostility. Some people thought that the presence of giants was a sign of God's blessing, while others thought it was a sign of doom. Life became very careful. Kids played quietly, farmers walked carefully near fields, and whole villages changed their routines to make room for beings who could accidentally mess up life just by being there. In these interactions, the story of the Nephilim shows how hard it is to live with power that is beyond understanding. It also shows how human weakness and superhuman strength can clash. The Nephilim were not immune to these pressures. They knew that they scared people and made them jealous, and they were struggling with feelings of being alone and having to take care of things. Some people wanted to use their gifts for good, like keeping people safe from natural dangers or teaching them skills that the Watchers had given them. Some people, who were angry or frustrated by limits, lashed out in ways that made people more scared. Their moral choices were influenced not only by innate tendencies, but also by human responses to their presence. In this way, the giants were like mirrors of people, showing both good and bad things in a bigger way. Their extraordinary nature made ordinary problems seem bigger, showing what happens when power is not controlled by wisdom or restraint. The stories about the Nephilim quickly became part of the larger cultural imagination. People told stories about their heroic and destructive deeds, which eventually affected written traditions. People who lived near them or their descendants told stories of great strength, moral conflict, and sad endings. These stories helped people think about moral issues, how to use power, and how divine intervention affects daily life. The text emphasizes the tension between human innocence and the potential for corruption by focusing on the giants' development. It shows how extraordinary lineage makes natural order more complicated. The Book of Giants depicts the early existence of the Nephilim not merely as fantastical, but as profoundly human in their emotional and social interactions. Their interactions with their mothers, other people, and each other show that they have complicated personalities that can be kind or cruel, humble or proud. This method makes the giants seem more human while keeping their amazing traits, making a story that connects the divine and the human, the extraordinary and the everyday. Their lives, full of conflict and possibility, show how fragile the balance is between inherited power, personal choice, and the moral consequences of living in a world that is already on the verge of falling apart. As the Nephilim grew up, they had more and more of an impact on human societies. Villages and tribes had to get used to them, finding a balance between fear and trust, respect and distrust. The conflict between people and giants was a symbol of the larger moral and spiritual chaos that was happening in the world. Before the flood, families that used to have problems with each other found that their problems got worse when beings who could change the balance with one action were around. This constant threat of disruption showed how fragile life was at the time, reinforcing the themes of moral ambiguity, ethical responsibility, and the consequences of divine transgression in a world that was becoming more and more extraordinary. The Nephilim's world was full of overwhelming presence and raw power. The landscape changed because of the sheer size and strength of beings that were bigger and stronger than anything humans had ever known. These giants walked the earth with almost no restrictions. Their movements shook the ground, and their voices echoed through valleys like thunder. Villages that used to thrive on quiet routines were now overshadowed by huge shapes that could crush buildings with one step, uproot trees with ease, and bend rivers with the strength of their limbs. Every interaction, whether planned or not, left behind signs of chaos and wonder. Farmers left fields that had been flattened by a careless giant. Hunters saw forests break apart under huge footsteps, and whole herds of animals ran away in fear when these beings got close. The giant society was less about rules and more about their basic instincts, which were made stronger by their hybrid nature. The strongest and biggest people were at the top of the hierarchy, and they were the ones who were in charge. Their social structures were always changing, sometimes working together and sometimes fighting with each other. Fights between the giants were as amazing as they were scary, with rivalries turning into displays of power that could destroy nearby human settlements. Villages near forests, rivers, or hills became unwitting battlefields for these fights, forcing people to find a delicate balance between living together and staying alive. People talked about nights when huge shadows loomed over their homes, mornings when their fields were ruined, and the constant fear that even the smallest thing a person did could make a Nephilim angry or destroy something by accident. People were in a dangerous state of awe and fear, Some tried to calm the giants down by giving them food or shelter, hoping to keep the peace. Some people tried to hide, build walls, or run away to faraway places, but there was no place that was truly safe. The Nephilim made people even more vulnerable in ways that are hard to imagine. For example, a child playing near the edge of a village could easily get hurt, livestock could be lost with just one step, and whole buildings could disappear under the weight of a giant. These events left a mark on the collective memory, instilling fear and respect in the culture. People told stories, sang songs, and whispered warnings about the tall ones as they moved from settlement to settlement. These stories mixed reality with myth as they were passed down from generation to generation. The giants also messed up wildlife in the same way. Before people could see the Nephilim, animals could sense them. They ran away in fear, which disturbed natural patterns. Both predators and prey were forced to leave their usual homes, which changed the environment in ways that affected many areas. As giants walked along the banks of rivers, they changed their course. They also accidentally cleared forests, and the sheer size of their movements threw nature off balance. People had to deal with the giants right away, but they also had to deal with the long-term effects on farming, hunting, and staying alive. In the world before the flood, it seemed like both human creativity and God's will were being tested by things that were beyond our understanding. The Nephilim behaved in a wide range of ways in their own communities. Some people tried to make things better by organizing themselves for safety, hunting, or exploring. Others went overboard, using their strength to control, compete, or just have fun. These behaviors were made worse by their mixed nature, part divine, part human, and showed the moral grayness that came from both families. As the giants got older, their personalities and habits became more clear. People who wanted peace often felt limited by what their friends did, while people who were angry or proud caused problems that even they couldn't fully control. This instability within contributed to a larger story of disorder and chaos that affected the whole world. When you picture a giant moving through a human village, you can see the movie images clearly. Houses fall down when the Nephilim take a wrong step, chickens run away, and streams of water change course. Kids hide behind walls, adults yell warnings, and the air is thick with fear and awe. These times show how weak people are compared to the giants who are always there. It seems like nature itself bends to their presence. Trees shake, rivers swell a little behind them, and the ground shakes as if it knows that something very powerful is walking on it. The story shows how beings who are both divine and human, powerful and morally complicated, can have a real effect on the world. There were always fights between giants and people. Small misunderstandings can turn into big problems. When a human community tried to fight back against the Nephilim, they often did so without meaning to, but their actions were very damaging, leaving settlements in ruins and families mourning. At the same time, fights between the giants could spread to human territory, making areas of fear where people had to be on guard all the time to stay alive. These early fights were the beginning of the divine intervention that would eventually change the world. They showed how limited human power is, what happens when strength is unchecked, and the moral problems that arise in a world where beings of great power exist without clear direction or limits. The giants' power went beyond just causing physical damage. It also had an effect on people's minds. People started to internalize fear, changing their daily lives to avoid being found or confronted. As communities worked out how to stay alive in the face of constant threats, cultural norms changed. Oral histories mixed facts with stories, showing both fear and admiration. The giants came to represent both divine blessing and possible anger, showing the tension between awe and fear that people feel when they see something amazing. These stories not only kept history alive, but they also taught moral and ethical lessons, stressing the dangers of power without wisdom and the results of actions that go against divine or natural order. The giants were not invincible, even though they were in charge. They faced internal struggles as well as external challenges, including rivalries within their own ranks and the growing unrest among humans who could no longer ignore their presence. Some giants showed compassion by protecting human communities or trying to making violence and chaos worse. This duality showed the ongoing conflict between potential and danger, showing how the Nephilim represented both creation and destruction. Their lives were like the world before the flood, a place of wonder, danger, moral gray areas, and growing conflict that needed God's attention. As the giants walked through forests, villages and rivers, they left both physical and non-physical marks on the land and on people. It became more and more clear that the world's balance had been upset. Their society was organized by strength and power, but it didn't have the self-control to get along peacefully with people or with nature. This imbalance made people feel tense, scared, and unsure of what was right and wrong, which set the stage for an intervention that would change life on Earth forever. The Nephilim's chaos showed how important it was to have limits, consequences, and a reckoning that would change the stories of both humans and gods. Sawe and Ohya, two giants whose presence loomed over the world before the flood, had dreams and visions that made them different from everyone else. These two were different from other Nephilim because they were in tune with something more than the physical world, a whisper of divine truth that came through dreams. When the world was quiet at night and the stars mirrored the movements of the cosmos, they saw visions in pieces, images that were both scary and enlightening. They saw clouds of judgment darkening the skies, waters rising over cities, and the faces of both humans and giants showing fear and confusion. These dreams had a heavy weight that made people pay attention because they contained warnings that could not be ignored. The giants had a hard time figuring out what they were seeing. While their minds were strong, they weren't used to abstract prophecy, and the images often came in the form of symbols. It was hard for them to understand how the world they knew could change so quickly, with mountains turning to ash, rivers swallowing valleys, and shadows swallowing the land. Mawe, who was often restless, walked under the stars, going over the visions in his head and trying to figure out if they were just hallucinations or messages from God. Ohya, who was calmer but still confused, looked through the bits of information the Watchers had given him to see if he could find any patterns that would help him understand the warnings. Their confusion was a sign of the general uncertainty of the time before the flood, when divine signs mixed with human and angelic sins in ways that few people could fully understand. Angel messengers and dreams both sent the warnings. These angels came up to Mahwe and Ohya and stressed how important and urgent their messages were. They talked about the judgment that was coming and how the giants' and humans' corruption and violence had upset the balance of creation. The angels' words were clear, but had a heavy, otherworldly quality, a mix of warning and sadness. Even though the giants were very strong, they were scared at these times because they knew the divine had power and that there would be consequences. Their strength couldn't protect them from being judged, and for the first time they realized how weak their own lives were. These messages caused a lot of moral tension. In a world where instinct, pride, and inherited strength often decided how people acted, Mawe and Ohya struggled to figure out what was right and wrong. Should they try to warn the other giants? Could they get other people to be careful? Or would their friends think the dreams were a sign of weakness or fear? These questions kept them up at night, making it hard for them to talk to both giants and people. They were torn between being loyal to their family, wanting to stay alive, and knowing that their actions, or lack of actions, could have big effects. Every choice became a moral test, with personal gain and moral duty in conflict. Fear and doubt were always with me. Mahwe had nights when the visions came back even stronger, showing not only destruction, but also the pain of innocent people caught in the middle of huge wars. Ohya felt the same doubts and fears, wondering if their actions could change the course of destiny, or if the collapse was unavoidable. These emotional problems made the giants seem more human, showing that even beings with a lot of power can feel vulnerable, guilty, and afraid of death. They may have understood better than most that power alone wasn't enough to deal with the moral problems of their time. But hope stayed with fear. In some visions, the giants saw a way to be saved, signs that their choices could change the course of events if they were smart and brave. These brief but powerful moments made them more determined to correctly interpret the warnings and ask for help. They were not just trying to stay alive. They were also trying to protect those who couldn't protect themselves and avoid disaster by using knowledge, wisdom, and self-control. The tension between hope and fear was a key part of the story, showing how even the most powerful people face moral problems that go beyond the physical world. People had different reactions to their efforts to warn other giants. Some people listened with interest because they could see patterns in the dreams that reminded them of their own experiences. Some people were skeptical or hostile, seeing the visions as threats to established power structures or as challenges to their own freedom. As Mahwe and Ohia tried to convince their peers who valued strength and instinct over caution and foresight, conflicts arose. These tensions show how pride and ambition can create both opportunity and conflict when they come together with knowledge and prophecy. This can change the way people interact in even the most extraordinary societies. The human world, on the other hand, didn't know much about the prophetic battles between the giants. Still, these visions showed up in people's actions and events that confused communities. Some villagers saw giants hesitate before destroying things, which was unusual for them because they usually didn't care about human lives. These small signs made people feel uneasy and curious, suggesting that there was a deeper moral and spiritual drama going on beneath the surface. People could tell that something strange was going on, even if they didn't know how big it was or what it meant for the universe. Mahwe and Ohia's dreams and visions also showed the conflict between knowing and doing. They knew what was going to happen and what choices they needed to make to get through it, but just because they understood didn't mean they could act. They were limited in their ability to convince others, change people's behavior, and predict how cosmic judgment would play out. Their struggle exemplifies a universal theme. The awareness of impending consequences frequently precedes the ability to intervene effectively, creating a space replete with anxiety, anticipation, and moral contemplation. These big people who are strong but also weak are both part of and watch a world that is on the verge of divine judgment. As the nights went by and the visions came back, Mahwe and Ohia's emotions grew heavier. They had to find a way to balance strength with responsibility, instinct with conscience, and ambition with the need to hold back. The divine warnings, which were hidden in angelic communication and symbolic images, needed to be carefully understood and acted upon. The giants moved through a world they could shape but not fully control, and the tension was real. Their story shows how power, morality, and foreknowledge can come together. It shows how beings who are both divine and human face challenges that test not only their strength, but also their ability to be wise, empathetic, and morally brave. The world before the flood was on the verge of falling apart, with chaos spreading to every part of human and giant society. The giants, who were very strong and very big, caused trouble wherever they went. Their presence, which used to be amazing, turned into a source of fear and instability. Villages and towns that had survived the first attacks with awe and fear were now having trouble keeping things in order. Houses were destroyed, fields were trampled, and livestock was killed, which kept human families on edge all the time. Even though the giants were born with a lot of power, they often didn't have the moral guidance to control their impulses. Their decisions, whether based on pride, curiosity, or defiance, made the people around them more vulnerable, which led to a rise in lawlessness and disorder. Human corruption grew worse, along with the giants' power. The Watchers had kept secrets about metallurgy, astronomy, and even forbidden arts safe, but they spread uncontrollably. People who had this knowledge often used it for their own gain, seeking power, money, and control over others. Weapons got deadlier, cities grew too quickly, and greed ruined trade and politics. People who put their own interests ahead of moral responsibility took over whole communities. Villagers told stories about rulers who used the Watcher's knowledge to build monuments and fortresses without caring about how many lives they ruined in the process. Civilizations grew in size and power, but their foundations were rotting with cruelty, injustice, and moral decay. Every day, violence was a part of life. People fought over resources, villages fought to stay alive, and giants and people fought to get along. The Nephilim were unpredictable and sometimes fought with each other, which destroyed nearby settlements. Things that should have been easy to settle turned into destruction on a scale that few could understand. Kids were scared and hid, mothers prayed in desperation, and fathers tried to protect their families with nothing but their own strength against giants who could knock down walls with one blow. The cycle of fear and revenge fed itself, making emotional pain worse and leaving no room for peace. The ripple effects of unchecked power broke up families, friendships, and whole communities. The misuse of divine knowledge made things worse. People who learned secrets from the Watchers often used them to get ahead, making new tools, weapons, and ways to control other people. This knowledge could have made society better in the hands of good people, but it made things worse in the hands of bad people. Cities got bigger, but so did oppression, and human creativity became a double-edged sword. The giants also tried out the gifts their angelic parents had given them. Sometimes they used them to make the world a better place, and other times they caused trouble without knowing what would happen. Nature itself felt the effects. Rivers moved because of the weight of giants, forests were cut down to make room for people, and animal populations shrank because of constant disturbance. The world before the flood was a mirror of the evil done by people and giants, with violence, greed, and carelessness leaving marks on the earth itself. Another layer of tension was added by going against God's order. Both humans and giants broke rules that had been made to keep things in balance. The Watchers fell on their own, but their children and the people they taught acted without thinking about higher moral responsibility. People in societies accepted too much, giving in to their desires and goals without limits. People built temples and altars to honor material power instead of divine guidance. Some people tried to fight the giants, either to get control or get back at them, but they often didn't think about what would happen next. The result was a world where it was hard to tell what was right and wrong, where self-interest clouded the line between right and wrong, and where suffering grew as people ignored lessons of humility and restraint. In the middle of all this chaos, people suffered even more. Families worked hard to rebuild what had been lost. Communities went hungry because crops were trampled or moved, and disease spread more easily in places where there was fighting. People felt a lot of grief, anger, and hopelessness. The emotional toll was huge. Fear was always there for kids as they grew up. They never knew when giants would show up or when a neighbor's greed would turn neighbor against neighbor. Elders mourned the deterioration of previously tranquil towns, reminiscing about epochs when humanity experienced greater concord. The effects of this corruption on people of all ages meant that the world before the flood was not only full of suffering right away, but also instability and moral confusion that lasted for a long time. It was clear that the environment was being destroyed. Forests were cut down to meet the needs of people and giants. Rivers were changed by bad engineering and the weight of huge footsteps, and fertile land became barren because it was used too much. Animals ran away, which threw off the balance of ecosystems and the natural cycles of life. People who depended on the land for food and shelter felt the effects right away. Famine, lack of resources, and fights over land became more and more common. This decline in the environment was like the moral decline that was taking over the world, making people feel like life had become impossible because of the combined power of giants and human ambition. Every mistake, whether it was made by a god or a person who thought too highly of themselves, had consequences that made survival even more important. Both emotionally and physically, the giants themselves were not safe from the corruption they saw. Some people did things out of spite or pride because they were frustrated that they couldn't help people. Others tried to bring order, but their methods were often harsh and based on strength instead of understanding. There were fights between different groups, and some giants tried to control or punish human groups, which made things even more unstable. Even actions that were meant to be good had unintended effects because their power made every choice bigger. The Nephilim's moral ambiguity mirrored the larger chaos, demonstrating how entities of significant potential could serve as both guardians and annihilators, influenced by instinct, curiosity, and inherited imperfections. The stress in this time before the flood kept getting worse. Every act of greed, every violent encounter, and every misuse of knowledge added to the chaos. Communities fought not only against physical damage, but also against the loss of trust, empathy, and social ties. Once a guiding force, human morality fell apart when fear and temptation were everywhere. The giants, who were both amazing and scary, acted as catalysts, making the effects of human choice and carelessness even worse. The combined effects of these actions made the line between survival and disaster thinner and thinner every day. And the world was on the verge of a dramatic reckoning. The stage was set for a huge intervention. The chaos, violence, and moral decay called for a response that was beyond what people could do. The world before the flood had become a mirror of its own corruption, showing what happens when people act without regard for their conscience or God's law. It was impossible to ignore the feeling of impending judgment as cities fell apart under the weight of ambition. Rivers and forests were changed by carelessness and strength, and families mourned in a world full of fear. Every part of the world, people, giants, and the environment was coming together for a crucial moment that showed the world couldn't stay in balance. Without some kind of extraordinary action, the warnings that Mawai and Oya sent out spread through the Nephilim, causing arguments and disagreements among the giants. Some people were so afraid that they could feel the weight of God's judgment in the visions and the messages the angels brought. The dreams they had about rising waters and collapsing lands had left them with a sense of inevitability that they couldn't ignore. These giants, who had once been able to do whatever they wanted with their power, started to wonder what their role was in the unfolding drama. Could they do something to stop the disaster, or were they just watching an unavoidable disaster happen? Fear and anxiety mixed with awe, making the air tense with instinct, pride, and conscience. There were voices of defiance and caution among the giants. Many people flat out ignored the warnings because they didn't want to believe that beings as powerful as they were could be limited by forces they didn't understand. They didn't believe in angelic messages because they were proud of their divine and human ancestry. They said that strength had always meant survival and that no flood or act of God could change the natural order they had ruled for generations. But even though they were defiant, doubts crept into their minds. When night fell and visions came back, showing rivers overflowing mountains and cities underwater, even the bravest Nephilim couldn't completely silence the fear that was eating away at them. The giants who listened to the warnings had to deal with their moral conscience. They understood the moral duty that came with being aware, unlike many of their peers. Could they do something to protect the innocent if destruction was coming? Could they use what they learned from the Watchers to lessen suffering instead of making it worse? Mahwai and Ohia in particular struggled with these issues, looking for ways to warn people or protect their giant friends. But there was a lot of uncertainty about each possible action. Giants were incredibly strong, but it was much harder to use foresight and moral clarity. Even the best intentions could have bad effects in a world that was already on the edge. Some giants tried to build shelters or move to higher ground, thinking that being higher up might protect them from God's judgment. They used old methods taught to them by the Watchers to shape earth and stone into shelters or fortifications. To make safe areas, rivers were moved, hills were strengthened, and parts of forests were cut down. But these efforts didn't always work out in real life. The visions hinted at a disaster that would be so big that even the strongest Nephilim would not be able to handle it. At first, what looked like preparation often turned out to be useless against the size of the threat. This showed how limited brute strength is when faced with cosmic forces. There were also arguments within the group about who was responsible and who was loyal. Some giants said that the only way to stay alive was to save themselves, and they pushed for isolation and self-preservation. Some people said that giants needed to stand together, even with humans. These different priorities broke alliances and caused problems in the Nephilim community. Meetings and councils, which were often held in dark valleys or on top of hills, became places where people fought over ideas. Giants yelled over each other, their fists hitting the ground, and their voices sounded like thunder in the distance. The moral weight of their decisions, along with the strong need to stay alive, made the situation even more tense. Each choice had effects that went beyond just staying alive, affecting the future of communities and the balance of the world before the flood. During these talks, Mahwai and Ohya often had to find a middle ground between two extremes. They begged for reason, using the visions as guides and the angels' messages as warnings that couldn't be ignored. But it was hard to persuade them. Giants were creatures of instinct who judged power by physical strength instead of moral reasoning. To get them to believe that strength alone wasn't enough to stop disaster, they had to appeal to their foresight and conscience, which were abstract ideas that were hard for even beings of their intelligence to understand. Even though they faced challenges, Mahwai and Ohya kept going, showing empathy and understanding that were very different from the impulsive, raw behavior of many of their peers. At the same time, humans noticed small changes in the way giants acted. Some Nephilim, who had been violent and unpredictable before, started to move carefully, stay away from settlements, or try to protect certain areas. People in the village whispered about these changes, not sure if they should be afraid of the giants' new actions or trust them. The way people saw things and how giants acted made things even more complicated, which caused tension in both communities. People couldn't fully understand the visions or the divine warnings behind them, but they could tell a storm was coming by the signs in the land and the way the giants moved. Fear, anticipation, and doubt were all present in a fragile balance, which showed how high the stakes were getting in the world before the flood. As the giants fought harder to stay alive, they ran into problems with both their power and their understanding. Even people who were very good at seeing visions and hearing prophetic warnings knew that getting ready didn't mean they would be safe. People could climb mountains, build shelters, and change the course of rivers, but the size of the coming judgment suggested that there were forces that were beyond understanding. The giants were under a lot of mental stress because they were both very strong and very weak at the same time. Dreams of survival and the need to act responsibly clashed with the terrifying knowledge that a flood was coming. This made every decision, conversation, and movement feel like they were on the edge of their seat. This increased tension also showed cracks in the giants' moral fiber. Some people took selfish or aggressive steps to get what they wanted, like controlling resources, their peers, or their own survival. Others chose to be kind and hold back, trying to protect those who were weaker, whether they were people or giants. The difference between these two approaches showed how morally complicated it is for beings who are caught between divine lineage and earthly experience. Every decision had an effect on the world before the flood, changing alliances, starting wars, and making the overall pattern of disaster more likely. As the days and nights went by, the story of the giants became one of desperation, strategy, and deep moral reckoning. Their arguments, their efforts to get in shape, and their attempts to make sense of their visions all added to the tension and suspense in the world. People watched with cautious interest as they saw patterns of behavior that suggested a moral and existential drama that they couldn't understand. Every step the giants took and every decision they made brought the world closer to the dramatic end that the visions and angels had warned about. The landscape before the flood was a stage where strength, conscience, fear, and hope all clashed, setting the stage for the events that would change the world forever. The skies got darker than ever before, and the whole world was cast in shadow. The clouds were thick and heavy, and they moved with a sense of dread, as if the heavens were getting ready for something bad to happen. The rivers rose, and the wind howled through the valleys, bringing with it a sense of inevitability. God told Noah to build a huge ark that would protect life during the coming flood. Noah worked hard to build it. He and his family worked all day and all night, driven by faith and obedience. Their hands were calloused, but their spirits were strong. As the ark got closer to being done, there was a sense of urgency in the air, as if something new and exciting was about to happen. The giants watched in shock and fear. Their huge size and strength, which used to give them power and confidence, seemed small in the face of forces they couldn't understand. Mahwai and Ohia, who had long had dreams and visions that warned them of this moment, watched with seriousness as the waters began to rise. The riverbanks, which had been swollen by non-stop rain, spilled over into farms and towns, forcing people and animals to run away. Mountains that people thought were too high to touch were hidden by sheets of rain, and winds ripped through forests, uprooting trees and sending debris crashing across the land. The giants, who had depended on brute force to stay alive, knew that nothing could stop the flood that was now sweeping across the earth. People panicked as the floodwaters rose quickly. Families held onto each other as they looked for higher ground and any way to be safe. Livestock and wildlife, confused and scared, ran in frantic herds, only to find themselves stuck by the rising waters. As the water rose to the base of Noah's Ark, a huge wooden sanctuary, it began to float. Animals of all kinds, 2 by 2, and following God's orders, got on the ship, their eyes wide with fear and confusion. People who listened to the warning were able to get on the ark, but those who didn't or didn't believe it had a hard time against the rising tide. The land was in chaos, with screams of fear and the sound of water crashing down on the ruined landscape. Even though the giants were huge, they weren't safe. Some people tried to climb mountains or cliffs in a last-ditch effort to stay alive, but the water rose faster than they thought it would. Some people tried to use their strength to fight the currents or build shelters, but the flood was too strong for them to succeed. Rocks and boulders were moved, trees were pulled up and smashed into walls, and the ground shook with the force of nature's anger. Even though Mahwai and Ohia were used to divine warnings, they could only watch as their family fought against the overwhelming tide, unable to change the outcome. The story of the flood is about both moral and physical judgment. Divine judgment was coming down on the giants' power, the corruption of humans, and the chaos that had taken over the world. Every wave, gust of wind, and crack of thunder reminded me that power and pride could not change the moral order. The waters destroyed everything in their path, just like how God intervened without bias. Those who had acted out of malice or selfishness faced the full force of the disaster. Noah and the righteous, on the other hand, found safety in the ark, where they were guided by faith and obedience instead of physical strength alone. As the flood goes on, cinematic images appear. It rained so hard that rivers turned into roaring torrents. The horizon disappeared behind sheets of water that never stopped, and valleys turned into lakes, and mountains turned into islands. Animals huddled together in fear, their cries mixing with the cries of people. The giants' huge bodies moved through the water with strong strokes, but even their strength couldn't stop the tide from rising. Some tried in vain to get a grip on cliffs or trees, and their desperation showed how useless power is when faced with the divine. The scene is huge and dramatic, with a mix of strength, fear, and judgment that is sure to happen. You can feel the emotional weight of the flood. People were sad about the deaths of loved ones and livestock, as well as the loss of homes and jobs. Giants experienced the fear and helplessness of death in a way they had never experienced before, even though they had been in charge before. The amount of suffering showed what happened because of choices made over many years, using knowledge wrong, being proud, and chasing power without caring about others. The waters didn't just wash away bodies. They changed the moral and spiritual order of the earth in a big way, cleaning it up and leaving lessons for those who lived. In the middle of all the chaos, the ark floated as a sign of hope and safety. Noah and his family steered the ship through the rough waters, giving shelter to animals big and small. Their obedience stood in stark contrast to the giants' arrogance and fear, showing that survival was not based on strength or lineage, but on following God's will. The contrast between human humility and giant helplessness makes the larger moral point: power without wisdom and obedience can fail, while faith and hard work can protect you even in the most difficult situations. It seemed like nature itself was part of the divine act. There were storms, lightning split the sky, and winds tore through forests, but the path of destruction was clear and guided by a force that couldn't be understood. Every wave and gust of wind was a sign of judgment, both real and symbolic, that washed away corruption and brought life back into balance on earth. Mountains, forests, and valleys all became temporary stages for the unfolding drama, showing what happens when people are arrogant, disobedient, or morally wrong. Even the giants, who were very powerful, were brought down by the unstoppable power of water and God's will. As the floodwaters rose, the story reached a dramatic peak. The giants' pointless fights, the chaos among humans, and the unstoppable force of nature all came together to make a world where nothing was certain except the power of divine judgment. The scenes of fear, desperation, and helplessness showed how high the stakes were, and the fact that the righteous were saved in the ark showed the difference between obedience and rebellion. This time of unprecedented chaos is a key moment in the biblical story. It shows how moral decay can have terrible effects, and how God will always step in to restore balance to the world. As the floodwaters slowly receded, a changed world appeared. It was quiet, but it was heavy with the memory of what had been lost. The ark, which finally came to rest on the mountaintop, was the first sign of life that had survived the storm. Noah and his family stepped onto the new land with a mix of relief and caution. They were guided by gratitude and respect, and their feet pressed into soil that had been cleaned but still had scars. Birds flew off the ark's deck, filling the air with cries of freedom. Animals cautiously stepped out into the open landscape, exploring the remains of a world that had almost been wiped out. Destruction and renewal could be seen in every part of the world. The giants' destruction and humanity's corruption left behind subtle signs of their presence, like a shadow woven into the rebirth of civilization. People still whispered and told stories about the giants who used to tower over both human settlements and forests. Even after the Nephilim's bodies were gone, stories about how big, strong, and chaotic their lives were lived on in myths. People who lived in the area and those who survived talked about mountains that shook when they walked on them, voices that were carried by the wind, and artifacts that were too big for normal hands to hold. These stories, which were full of mystery and exaggeration, were constant reminders of a time when greed and corruption were almost too much for the world to handle. The giant's shadow, though invisible, was etched into the minds of all people. It was a haunting presence that made it hard to tell what was real and what was legend. Afterward, human groups started the long process of rebuilding. Fields had been washed away, forests had been torn apart, and rivers had changed so much that they were unrecognizable. Survivors had to do the huge job of bringing life back to the earth by planting seeds in soil that had been flooded, but was now scarred by the flood. Even while they worked, they all knew that the giant's power was still there. Some people found signs of strange buildings, remains of huge homes, or pieces of tools and weapons that were too big for most people. Each new discovery filled them with awe and fear, reminding them that beings far beyond their understanding had once shaped the world they now lived in. They also remembered the lessons of restraint, morality, and divine order that they had learned. The giants' presence also stayed in people's moral memory. People told stories around fires and passed them down from parent to child about how arrogant they were, how they went against God's order, and how much damage they had done. They were a warning about the risks of corruption, using knowledge for bad purposes and seeking power without caring about others. People thought about the echoes of their strength struggles and even their moments of fear and doubt before the flood in the shadows of mountains and forests. These stories did more than just entertain. They also taught people that being great without moral responsibility had effects that went beyond personal ambition. Even after they died, the giants had an effect on how people thought about culture, morals, and the divine. As survivors tried to figure out what the flood meant, their spiritual reflection deepened. The waters had wiped out all life, but they had kept those who were right and obeyed. The Nephilim, despite their strength, gave in to their desires, and their fall became a lesson for all of humanity. The stories of the Watcher's forbidden knowledge, the giants' bold defiance, and the judgment that followed were not just old tales. They were lessons that are still important today. Every generation that rebuilt the earth remembered the lessons they had learned and took to heart the warning that unchecked greed and ambition could call forth powers beyond human control. The giant's shadow stayed around as a warning and a guide, shaping human thought long after their bodies were gone. Soon, artists, poets, and storytellers started to add the giants to the fabric of human imagination. Their huge shapes stood for the internal conflict between desire and restraint, strength and humility. In paintings, they looked like huge figures standing over villages. In literature, they were examples of pride and moral failure. In oral tradition, they were examples of caution and respect. The images of huge beings who had once walked the earth stayed in people's minds, even in their dreams, and haunted those who wanted to learn from the past. This cultural imprint made sure that the giants before the flood would never be forgotten. Their story lived on not only in scripture, but also in the memories of all people, shaping how generations thought about power, morality, and divine justice. The scars left on the land by the flood also silently told the story of the giants' past. Valleys were changed, rivers took new paths, and forests grew back on land that had once been walked on by huge beings. But even though life had come back, there were still signs of the past. Huge footprints carved into bedrock, structures that were too big for normal work, and bones that were too big to understand. These artifacts made people feel awe and made them think. They reminded survivors that the land they now cared for had once been home to beings whose power had changed the land itself. The giants' legacy is still remembered in both physical and cultural ways, connecting the world that was with the world that is being reborn. The story of the giants had a big effect on how people felt. The flood had scared and cleansed people, and those who lived through it felt very weak and grateful. The idea that such power could exist and be used without moral restraint made people more humble and careful. Children learned about the giants' amazing powers, their acts of both wonder and fear, and what happens when you are too proud in front of God's order. This moral and emotional inheritance shaped not only survival, but also the emerging human identity, a consciousness aware of the weight of choice, the consequences of defiance, and the enduring need to honor the laws that govern both human and divine relationships. The story of the giants lived on in myths and the Bible for hundreds of years after they died. Their lives, their struggles, and their tragic end became part of the story of humanity's journey. This is a haunting reminder that power without conscience and knowledge without morality can have effects that can't be undone. The shadow they left was not just physical, it was also spiritual and psychological. It changed the way people thought about cultural ethics, moral philosophy, and how to understand God's will. The Nephilim's legacy served as a reminder to humanity that the past, despite being erased by floodwaters, endures in memory and serves as a warning. The giants that lived before the flood are no longer here in body, but they are still alive in lesson. Their unusual lives, The chaos they caused and the judgment they faced became a model for how to think about the relationship between strength, morality, and divine oversight. People who were spared and saved were left to figure out what their shadow meant, learn from their mistakes, and rebuild a world based on both respect and knowledge. The effects of what they did continued to spread across the land, carrying a weight of caution, reflection, and memory that no flood could completely wash away. In this way, the giants lived on, not in bodies, but in the stories and morals that people tell and live by. The Ethiopian Bible has a lot of biblical stories that are missing, changed, or much shorter in Western versions. The stories of the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the Book of Giants are some of these. They give us a better understanding of what happened before the flood, which is mostly hidden in most Western traditions. The Western canon often focuses on the story of Noah and the flood waters, but the Ethiopian texts go deeper. They show the giants not as myths or symbolic warnings, but as real beings whose actions had a direct effect on the course of human history. The stories give names, family trees, and detailed accounts of how they interacted with people, keeping the moral and spiritual lessons that went along with these events before the flood. Western Bibles, on the other hand, tend to leave out these stories because of years of editorial choice. Instead, they only include short references in Genesis or partial translations of the Book of Enoch. The Watchers, angels who came to earth to talk to people, are where this difference starts. The Ethiopian Bible gives a very detailed account of their fall, the giving of forbidden knowledge, and the moral and physical effects that followed. Readers learn about the specific things the Watchers taught people, like astronomy, metallurgy, charms, and other strange sciences, and how this knowledge messed up the natural order. In Western versions, a lot of this is left out or shortened, which makes it harder to understand how these interactions ruined both human society and the natural world. The Ethiopian texts depict not only the facts, but also the motivations, uncertainties, and internal conflicts of the Watchers, thereby humanizing these celestial entities and prompting contemplation on the essence of authority, responsibility, and the repercussions of transgressing divine limits. The stories about the giants are also very different in the two traditions. The Ethiopian Bible gives a lot of detail about the Nephilim, including how big they were, how strong they were, and how scared they made regular people. These texts examine their moral ambiguity, depicting them not merely as villains, but as intricate entities ensnared between divine retribution and human intrigue. In contrast, Western texts only briefly mention the giants in Genesis, which often makes them hard to understand. The absence of descriptive detail in Western Bibles reduces the emotional and psychological impact of the narrative. By keeping these stories alive, the Ethiopian Bible shows what happens when spiritual and human worlds mix. The giant's existence is a warning about the dangers of too much power and moral decay. The Ethiopian Bible is also different in that it has a lot of prophetic warnings. Characters like Mawe and Oya, who are also giants, have visions and dreams that warn them about the flood and give them moral and practical advice. These prophetic elements are elaborated upon with dramatic tension and moral contemplation, emphasizing the giants' difficulty in deciphering divine messages and making decisions within the constraints of their existence. In Western texts, these layers of prophecy are either missing or shortened, which makes the story less interesting and makes it harder for the audience to understand the moral stakes. So the Ethiopian texts not only tell stories about the past, but they also teach lessons about being responsible, being able to see the future, and the bad things that happen when you don't listen to God. This gives readers a better moral and philosophical framework. The difference goes on after the flood. Both traditions recognize the purification of the earth. However, the Ethiopian Bible retains the enduring impact of the giant's shadow, illustrating how human memory, legends, and cultural artifacts embody the moral lessons of pre-flood corruption. This point of view gives us a more complex view of history, destruction is not total, and moral lessons stay with us even after disaster. Western versions, which focus on survival and covenant, often downplay this continuity and don't give much thought to what the giant's existence means for people after the flood. The Ethiopian texts encourage readers to contemplate continuity, memory, and moral inheritance, depicting a reality in which historical lessons actively influence the present and future. For scholars, theologians, and inquisitive readers, these distinctions highlight the significance of examining apocryphal texts. The Book of Giants, along with the larger Ethiopian canon, gives us a new look at biblical history, showing us events, moral lessons, and spiritual truths that most Western Bibles don't cover. By looking at these sources, you can see how complicated the early interactions between humans and gods were, how unchecked ambition and forbidden knowledge can cause problems, and how moral failure can have lasting effects. The narratives also make us think about the interpretive processes that have shaped different religious traditions. They show how omissions and editorial choices can have a big effect on collective memory and moral frameworks. Also, the Ethiopian Bible makes all of its characters, even angels and giants, more human, which makes the story resonate with both the mind and the heart. The giants' internal conflicts, fears, and moral quandaries are depicted with equal meticulousness as those of human protagonists, cultivating empathy and enhanced engagement. This makes people think about their own moral choices, how knowledge and power can be abused, and how choices can affect the community and the environment in a bigger way. By cutting out or simplifying these stories, Western versions often miss this emotional aspect, which makes it harder for people to understand how things were before the flood. The Ethiopian story is also rich because it pays attention to continuity and consequence. Each story thread, the Watcher's fall, the sharing of forbidden knowledge, the giant's birth and actions, and the prophetic warnings are all connected. This makes a tapestry of cause and effect that is mostly missing from Western texts. These stories show how corruption can get worse over time, how moral failings can get worse over generations, and how divine justice tries to bring things back into balance. This all-encompassing approach turns ancient history into a moral and spiritual guide by showing readers not only what happened, but also why it was important and how similar ideas may still be relevant. Today, comparing the Ethiopian and Western biblical texts helps people understand how deep the biblical tradition is beyond what is usually taught. The Ethiopian canon contains many stories and moral lessons that make modern readers think critically about power, responsibility, and how to keep ethical knowledge alive. It also piques interest and encourages people to look into apocryphal works to find forgotten or hidden parts of how humans and gods interact. By doing this, it shows that the biblical world is much more complicated and morally ambiguous than what Western summaries show. And it teaches lessons that are just as relevant today as they were back then. Through this comparative lens, the pre-flood giants are not distant myths, but important parts of a detailed history of how humans and gods interacted. Their stories, which are still in the Ethiopian Bible, show the moral stakes, human struggles, and divine interventions that shaped the ancient world. By understanding these differences, audiences can see the value of looking at more than one source and appreciate the spiritual and moral lessons that are built into the stories. The Ethiopian texts in particular make readers think about the bigger effects of both human and supernatural actions. This helps them understand morality, justice, and the divine plan in ways that Western Bibles don't always do. The story of the giants and the Watchers is still very clear in the modern world, even though it happened thousands of years ago. Before the flood, angels came down and the Nephilim were born. This was a time when people abused their knowledge and power, ignored morality, and faced huge consequences for their actions. Today, even though there aren't any real giants anymore, the moral problems are still very familiar. The allure of forbidden knowledge, the quest for unaccountable power, and the effects of human corruption on society and the environment are all reflected in modern existence. The lessons in these old stories are still important today, from how we use technology to how we hurt the environment. They make us think about how we use knowledge and power. One of the most obvious similarities is how knowledge is used wrong. Just like the Watchers taught people how to work with metals, stars, and magic, modern society has access to more information and technology than ever before. But with this access comes responsibility. The Nephilim were very strong, but they often acted without thinking ahead or following moral rules, which caused a lot of damage and chaos. In the same way, people and groups today have to decide how to use knowledge, whether it's in genetic engineering, artificial intelligence, or managing the environment. These choices can lead to great progress, but unchecked ambition, like that of the giants, can cause harm without meaning to. The old stories are like a warning mirror that reminds people that every new ability has moral weight. Corruption and the decline of moral standards, which are important parts of the giant story, are still relevant today. Greed, violence, and the exploitation of others were common in the world before the flood. The giants' incredible power made these problems even worse. In today's world, social, political, and economic inequalities can be seen as modern versions of these old problems. When people or groups put their own needs ahead of others, it usually leads to problems in society, unfairness, and damage to the environment. The story of the giants shows that power without conscience makes things worse. This shows how important it is for leaders, innovators, and people in everyday life to be morally responsible. Another lesson that will last is responsibility. The giants fell not just because of their strength or skills, but because they made choices that went against moral and divine advice. Today, everyone has to make similar choices, from being honest with themselves to being responsible for society. Ethical behavior may not always yield immediate rewards, yet historical precedents, both ancient and contemporary, illustrate that choices are significant and consequences are lasting. By thinking about what the giants went through, people can better understand how important it is to think about how their actions will affect others in the long run. The stories also show what happens when you don't listen to warnings or moral lessons. In the Book of Giants, prophetic messages and dreams told people to be careful, but these warnings were often ignored or misunderstood, which sped up the path to destruction. In today's world, this is seen in how people ignore environmental signals, public health warnings, and ethical advice in technology and government. The stories that come before the flood remind people that being aware of and following moral advice is very important. If you ignore signs of moral, social, or environmental imbalance, you risk repeating history in new ways and causing disasters that could have been avoided. With more awareness and action, there are also lessons from the giants' time that we can learn from our relationships with other people. The Nephilim lived in a world full of tension, where power and ambition made it hard to trust, be loyal, and work together. Families, communities, and leaders had a hard time dealing with these problems, and many times the results were tragic. Contemporary parallels are evident in interpersonal relationships, community disputes, and organizational frameworks, where the abuse of power or neglect of ethical boundaries results in tension, distrust, or systemic collapse. Comprehending these ancient narratives can assist individuals in cultivating healthier relationships and ethical decision-making, highlighting empathy, justice, and accountability. The story of the giants also teaches us to be humble. Even beings of extraordinary ability and size were subject to forces beyond their control, ultimately unable to escape divine judgment. No matter how advanced or powerful people become, there are still limits, physical, moral, and social, that cannot be ignored. By knowing these limits, people can find a balance between ambition and humility. This reminds them that moral integrity and respect for natural or spiritual laws are important for long-term success. The giant's fate shows that being arrogant and ignoring universal rules will always have consequences. These stories make you think about your own and other people's morals. People can relate to the giants' problems, the temptation to misuse knowledge, the appeal of unchecked power, and the difficulty of making morally sound choices in complicated situations. When people internalize these lessons, they can make decisions with more thoughtfulness, weighing the short-term benefits against the long-term costs. These stories make people more aware of their own morals and inspire them to act in ways that are thoughtful, principled, and take into account the effects on society and the environment as a whole. These lessons are still useful today in areas like leadership, governance, and global responsibility. The choices we make today, whether they are about corporate policy, new technology, or caring for the environment, have effects that go far beyond our own communities and the natural world. Leaders and decision-makers can derive from the pre-flood narratives a deep comprehension of responsibility, prudence, and the imperative of aligning authority with moral consideration. This viewpoint encourages a society that is more focused on justice, sustainability, and the common good, which is similar to the moral lessons found in ancient texts. Lastly, the giant's story is still important because it makes people think about themselves. These stories are different from abstract moral lessons because they use drama, emotion, and vivid imagery to teach deep moral lessons. They make people think about how their actions affect other people and make them think deeply about issues of right and wrong, power and restraint, knowledge and responsibility. The giant's legacy, while grounded in antiquity, offers a perspective for contemporary individuals to assess decisions, identify patterns of corruption, and pursue a more conscientious and ethical existence. By thinking about these things, the story of the world before the flood becomes a mirror for today's world. The lessons it teaches about responsibility, morality, and the effects of actions like using knowledge incorrectly, abusing power, or ignoring warnings, are still very relevant. By thinking about these old events, viewers are encouraged to use what they learn in their daily lives to make decisions that are in line with moral values, protect communities, and respect the lines that keep the balance between people and nature. Once a story of cosmic and human conflict, the giant's story is now a guide for modern minds, connecting the past and the present with lessons that are still relevant today. The story of the giants, the Watchers, and the world before the flood comes to its most dramatic end with the destruction of divine judgment. The sky opened up, and the waters came down with an unstoppable force, swallowing up mountains, forests, and the huge cities that had once been full of life and chaos. The Nephilim, huge beings with unimaginable strength and presence, fought against the unending flood, but their power was useless against the will of God. In those last moments, you could almost hear their cries echoing across the water, a sad symphony of pride, loss, and desperation. The same harsh cleansing happened to human civilization. The world's corruption, greed, and violence were swept away in a way that left no sign of the old order. But even though the waters washed away their bodies, their shadows stayed in people's minds, haunting stories, myths, and the moral fabric of future generations. These shadows are more than just stories. They are warnings that have been carved into the minds of people. The giants weren't just huge creatures. They were also warnings about what happens when people use power and knowledge without being smart or careful. Their existence compelled humanity to confront the repercussions of ethical negligence, the perils of unrestrained curiosity, and the destruction caused by defiance of divine direction. The Watchers also left their mark, teaching that even people with a lot of intelligence and spiritual authority can fail when their motives are unclear or they don't take moral responsibility for their actions. These lessons are timeless. They connect the past and the present and make us think about our choices, our goals, and how we balance knowledge, power, and morality. Even though the flood left everything empty, these stories lived on through oral traditions, early writings, and eventually the preservation of texts like the Book of Giants in the Ethiopian Bible. These texts do more than just tell stories from the past. They also give us moral and ethical guidelines that still matter today. As people think about these stories, they start to see how the problems we face today are similar to those that existed before the flood. Neglecting the environment, misusing technology, and social corruption are all modern examples of old patterns. The story of the giants, which is both dramatic and tragic, makes us think about the moral lessons that can be learned from being human. It reminds us that every action has consequences and that the effects of abusing power can last long after the moment has passed. The flood's cinematic images, giants fighting in the water, trees being ripped from the ground, and a constant downpour add to both the drama and the emotional impact. It makes you feel the weight of the events, empathize with both human and non-human beings, and realize that the story is more than just a story of destruction. It is a meditation on duty, morality, and divine justice. In these waters, every time we are arrogant, greedy, or morally wrong, we see it clearly and without mercy. The flood is both real and a metaphor for getting rid of corruption, restoring order, and always being on the lookout for moral problems in life. But the story doesn't end in sadness. The shadows of the giants that people remember and tell stories about help people find their way. They encourage people to think about themselves and recognize patterns of bad behavior before they get out of hand. These stories, like the giants' legacy, make modern viewers think about their own moral choices, how they use knowledge and power, and the duties they have to others and the world around them. The lessons are as cinematic and vivid as the ancient story itself, but they are very personal, showing how we all deal with temptation, ambition, and our conscience. People who are watching today have a chance to not only see history, but also do something about it. Think about the moral problems that the giants and the watchers bring up. Think about how today's world deals with the balance between knowledge, power, and moral duty. Read the Ethiopian Bible and the Book of Enoch to learn about stories that show new sides of biblical history and moral lessons. Share these stories, talk about what they teach, and think about how they apply to your daily life. Knowing that the past always shapes the present, there is also a call to action as we reach the emotional end of this epic story. If you like this trip into the world before the flood, please subscribe to the channel and share this video with your friends to help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support through Super Thanks makes it possible to make more content that uncovers hidden biblical stories and brings to light forgotten histories. Please leave a comment below with your name, city, and the time you're watching from. This is a way to connect with others who are interested in the depths of ancient wisdom and spiritual insight. If you want to read the whole Bible, all 88 books, or the Book of Enoch in English, the links are in the description for your convenience. This will let you learn even more about these hidden stories and the lessons they teach. The story of the giants, how they rose and fell, the chaos they caused, and the divine intervention that changed the world is still very important. The poetic truth is that the waters may have washed away their bodies, but their shadows still cling to human history. They stay with us in the stories we tell, the moral lessons we learn, and the way we think about our own choices. These shadows test us, make us think, and force us to act with honesty, integrity, and a sense of responsibility. These things remind us that history is never really gone. It lives on in us, pushing us to learn, think, and work toward a world where moral courage and ethical understanding guide us. What really happened before the flood? Who were the giants that walked the earth, towering over humanity, leaving their shadows etched into the memory of generations? These are not mere myths or exaggerated tales. The Book of Giants, a forgotten text preserved in the Ethiopian Bible and discovered among the Dead Sea Scrolls, tells a story that Western biblical traditions barely touch. It speaks of a time when angels, known as the Watchers, descended to earth, defying divine law, and shared forbidden knowledge with humans. They taught secrets of the heavens and the earth, astronomy, metalwork, incantations, but in doing so, They altered the natural order. From these unions between watchers and human women came the Nephilim, beings of extraordinary size and power, whose presence shook the foundations of human society. The story of the Nephilim is more than just a tale of giants. It is a reflection on the consequences of power, curiosity, and rebellion. Imagine a world where the natural balance was disrupted, where knowledge was misused not for growth, but for domination. These giants were not merely physical marvels. They were agents of chaos, capable of violence and destruction that left entire communities terrified. Their very existence challenged the fragile moral fabric of humanity, highlighting the dangers of unchecked influence and the blurred lines between divine will and human ambition. In this context, the pre-flood world becomes more than history. It becomes a mirror for modern society, where technology and knowledge can create both wonders and disasters if wielded without wisdom. The Watchers themselves are fascinating figures. They were angels, beings of light and authority, yet they succumbed to desire and curiosity, drawn to the human world in ways that defied divine instruction. Their fascination with humanity was not innocent. It was a blend of admiration, ambition, and the temptation of power. By sharing knowledge that humans were not ready to wield, they created a ripple effect that transformed the earth. The Nephilim, born from these unions, inherited both the strength of the angels and the flaws of humanity. They became figures of awe and terror, inspiring stories and legends that would persist long after their disappearance. Through their tale, the Book of Giants asks profound questions about responsibility, morality, and the boundaries of knowledge. The pre-flood era, as described in these texts, was one of tension and imbalance. Human societies were struggling with their own moral and ethical choices, and the arrival of the Nephilim only magnified those struggles. Communities feared the giants, but they also envied them. Humans coveted the knowledge that the Watchers had brought, hoping to harness it for themselves. The result was a world teetering on the brink, where violence and corruption became daily realities. These narratives, while ancient, resonate with modern concerns: how power can corrupt, how knowledge without discipline can harm, and how ethical choices determine the fate of civilizations. By looking at the Nephilim and the Watchers, we are reminded that history is not only about events, but about the choices and consequences that define them. Yet, there is a deeper human connection within these stories. Despite their supernatural origin, the Nephilim experienced fear, doubt, and moral conflict. They were not invincible beings without conscience. Their extraordinary abilities were paired with the same struggles that humans face: the challenge of understanding right from wrong, the temptation to dominate, and the burden of choice. By humanizing these figures, the Book of Giants allows us to see ourselves in their story. It suggests that even beings of immense power are bound by the same ethical and spiritual dilemmas that govern human life. Their narrative is both a warning and an invitation to consider how knowledge, power, and morality intertwine in shaping the destiny of the world. The historical and biblical context of this story adds layers of significance. The Nephilim and the Watchers appear briefly in the canonical Hebrew Bible, but their story is fully revealed in apocryphal texts like the Book of Giants. These writings provide insight into the world before Noah, offering perspectives that challenge and expand our understanding of ancient scripture. They show a civilization grappling with extraordinary beings, divine interventions, and moral crises. The flood, as a response to this corruption, is portrayed not just as a historical event, but as a necessary reset, a moment where the world had to be cleansed so that humanity could begin anew. Understanding this context helps us grasp why these stories persisted, why they were preserved in certain traditions, and why they continue to captivate readers today. The imagery evoked by the Book of Giants is vivid and cinematic. Picture a towering Nephilim walking through a city, their very presence casting a shadow that chills and awes the human inhabitants. Imagine the watchers descending from the skies, bringing forbidden knowledge that humanity is eager yet unprepared to receive. These scenes, though ancient, feel immediate because they explore universal human themes: the allure of power, the consequences of disobedience, and the eternal struggle between what is known and what is forbidden. By framing the narrative in such a vivid way, the story becomes not just historical or religious, but deeply relatable, engaging viewers as though they are witnessing these events firsthand. As we begin this journey into the world before the flood, it is essential to reflect on what the story asks of us today. The Nephilim and the Watchers were part of a world that faced moral collapse because knowledge was misused and boundaries were crossed. In our own time, we navigate similarly complex terrains, with technologies and insights that can either build or destroy. Their story, preserved through centuries, serves as a timeless reminder of the responsibilities that come with power and knowledge, of the consequences of choices made without foresight, and of the shadows that linger long after events have passed. If you find this story intriguing and want to uncover more of these hidden biblical narratives, make sure to subscribe to our channel, share this video with your friends, and help us reach 10,000 subscribers. Your support through a super thanks allows us to continue creating these stories. Also, comment below with your name and city, letting us know where you are watching from. If you wish to read the complete Bible 88 books or the Book of Enoch in English, the links are provided in the description. Your engagement keeps this journey alive and ensures that these ancient, forgotten stories reach new audiences. The first pieces of the Book of Giants were found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which had been buried for hundreds of years in the dry caves near Qumran. These scrolls, which were written during the Second Temple period, had parts of texts that Western traditions had long since forgotten. The Book of Giants goes into more detail about the Nephilim, who were the children of the Watchers and human women, than what is found in the Bible. This text, on the other hand, goes into great detail about the world before the flood, when huge beings walked the earth, bringing both awe and fear. The Ethiopian Bible, which has all 88 books, kept these stories from being completely lost, even though many Western translations left them out or made them much shorter. Scholars gained important knowledge about early Jewish thought and apocryphal literature from the discovery of these fragments. The text is apocryphal, which means that it wasn't accepted by everyone into the Hebrew Bible or the Christian Old Testament. However, it does give ideas that are very similar to those in the Book of Enoch. The Book of Enoch tells the story of how the Watchers came down to earth and gave people forbidden knowledge. The Book of Giants, on the other hand, is about the children of these angels and humans, their lives, their moral struggles, and the bad things that will happen because of what they do. These complementary texts provide a more comprehensive understanding of ancient cosmology, divine justice, and the conflict between corruption and righteousness in the antediluvian era. The pieces show a world that was both strange and familiar. Not only were the Nephilim big, they were also smart, aware, and able to make moral decisions. Some people wanted to be forgiven or to understand God's will, while others did what they wanted, which upset the balance of human society. The text tells these stories with vivid pictures, often in the form of conversations between the giants as they tell each other about their fears and visions. Scholars have observed that these narratives were probably part of a larger collection of writings that aim to explain where evil comes from and what happens when people cross divine lines. The apocryphal character of the Book of Giants elucidates its relative obscurity. In Western biblical traditions, early translators and religious leaders often chose texts to be part of the canon based on how well they fit with their beliefs, how consistent their teachings were, and how useful they thought they would be spiritually. Tales of angelic beings copulating with humans, producing hybrid progeny, and the intricate moral dilemmas faced by these titans probably appeared contentious or even perilous to conventional religious doctrines. As a result, many of these stories were left out of Western Bibles, and texts like Genesis 6 only mention the Nephilim in passing or in pieces. The Ethiopian Bible, on the other hand, kept a larger number of books, such as the Book of Enoch and the Book of Giants. This is how these rich stories were able to live on. The Book of Giants is important not only because of its story, but also because of the time and place it was written. The text comes from a time when Jewish communities were trying to figure out what divine justice, human responsibility, and evil in the world meant. The scrolls indicate that these narratives were extensively disseminated among specific sects, providing moral guidance and theological contemplation. These fragments show how divine beings and humans interact, which is similar to how people today are worried about morality, social order, and the limits of what humans can know. People told stories about giants that weren't just made-up stories. They were also lessons about pride, ambition, and what happens when you break God's laws. Parts of the scrolls also suggest that the Book of Giants had visions and dreams that the giants themselves understood. These dreams often hinted at the flood that was about to happen, which added tension to the story and made it clear that divine judgment was unavoidable. Some giants, knowing what was going to happen, asked for help or mercy, while others stood their ground, showing a range of moral awareness. The Book of Giants stands out from simpler biblical stories because of its complicated plot. This shows how early Jewish literature was able to explore moral and spiritual issues in a deeper way. The link to the Book of Enoch is very important for understanding the bigger picture of theology. Enoch acts as a good middleman, passing on God's warnings and keeping track of what the Watchers do. The Book of Giants, on the other hand, is about the hybrid's own experiences. This additional point of view helps us understand how early communities may have thought about how God and people interacted and what happened when people broke moral rules. It highlights the giants' human-like traits, such as their fears, struggles, and even their efforts to understand things, which makes their story relatable, even though they are very different from us. There are many references to the Bible throughout the text that make it more real and connect it to canonical scripture. The story is set in a familiar biblical world because it talks about the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the corruption that happened before the flood. The text's credibility is also supported by its historical context. The fragments are from the first few centuries BCE, which was a time of great literary and religious activity in Jewish communities. These groups were writing apocalyptic works, moral essays, and stories that built on well-known scriptures. This suggests that the Book of Giants was part of a larger intellectual and spiritual effort to understand human suffering, divine justice, and the order of the universe. There are many reasons why it is not present in Western biblical stories. Aside from worries about controversial material, the fact that surviving manuscripts were incomplete made it hard for early translators to put together a coherent text. Theological conservatism also preferred texts that supported existing doctrine, which meant that stories that were more complicated, morally gray, or sensational were not included in the canon. The Book of Giants' survival in Ethiopian Christianity shows how different early biblical traditions were, and how different groups valued and kept different texts. This variety shows how important it is to look at more than one source to fully understand pre-flood stories and the moral and spiritual lessons they teach. The Book of Giants still gives us deep insights into how people thought, how they lived morally, and how they thought about spirituality because it has been preserved. It makes readers think about the lines between divine and human action, the effects of moral choice, and how knowledge can be both helpful and harmful. Its rich story, true to life history, and ties to canonical scripture make it an important resource for anyone who wants to learn more about the complicated history of the time before the flood and the lasting interest in giants and the Watchers. The scrolls remind us that there are many parts of biblical history that most people don't know about, but that are still important to communities that are trying to figure out what is right and wrong, who has power and how God works. By looking at where the Book of Giants came from, why it is not in the Bible, and how it is kept in the Ethiopian Bible, you can better understand how complicated biblical history is. The text connects canonical scripture with the more complex and detailed stories that ancient communities used to understand their world. Its rediscovery gives modern readers a chance to see a world that is both far away and very close to the human experience, showing how beings who lived on earth long before the flood came to be, what they went through, and the moral choices they had to make. The Watchers were unlike anything humans had ever seen before. They were angels made to serve, watch over and keep the balance of creation, but something inside them made them want more than just to obey. They were drawn to the beauty, strength, and complexity of the human world, so they started to stay where they shouldn't have. Their fall wasn't a sudden act of rebellion. It was a slow pull toward curiosity, interest, and finally defiance. They walked among people without being seen, but they had an effect on them. They watched how life worked and how human civilizations grew.